You know, I was raised in a culture that does not remember its indigenous knowledge systems. I was not raised with my ancestral indigenous knowledge. And like many of us, I went through the Eurocentric education system and I learned how to forget myself. And then there was this one day when I was in my first year of university. I was studying biology at the University of Western Ontario, situated in London, Ontario, a city renamed after its British settlers. And I was walking over the bridge that goes over the Thames River on the university campus. The Thames River, again, another river that's been renamed after its British colonizers after the Thames River in England. I was going over the Thames River. And I got to the top of the bridge and I heard this voice that said, "You don't have to come back next year." And I was like, what? What do you mean I don't have to come back? Like, of course I'll go back to school next year. I was loving school. And I was someone who was brought up in a system that I had conformed and adapted to really well. I loved the Eurocentric education system, sitting in those rows, memorizing the textbooks, getting my 90%, my 100%, being top of the class. Every single subject. That's who I was. That's what I did. I was an academic and I was proud of this intelligence that I had, that I was told was somehow superior. And it never occurred to me that I wouldn't continue going back to school or that that was even an option. But this voice just kept saying, yeah, but you know, you don't have to. You don't have to. And the more I thought about it, the more I was like, yeah, I don't have to go to school. What if I took a year off? What if I took a year off? Because I was studying biology. I wanted to go to medical school. Conventional medical school was where I was on track towards, not necessarily because that was my calling, but because I was a young woman of color, really good at math and science. And you get a lot of reinforcement at a young age from parents, from teachers, from society. If you are top of the class as a young woman in science, you're going to be a great doctor. You should become a doctor. So that's what I was becoming. And I thought, you know what, let's just take a year off and enjoy life. I'm going to be in school for the next 10 years at least. So I did. So I stepped off that line and I pretty quickly became depressed within those first few months as everyone else went back to school and I was not going back to everything that had defined me up until that point. Academics, that was such a big part of my identity. And I felt really lost and had no structure around me, no constant appraisals and appraising and that constant feedback of those marks, right? That let me know I was smart. And there was nothing. But one thing I did start doing was picking up pen and paper, and I just started drawing circles and curves. And I was doodling, and it was a way of exploring my emotions and my feelings. And eventually this creative process became what I call curve art. And this curve art was instrumental during that year off in helping to guide me on this nonlinear path that I was now on. And I will show you some images of the curve art and what it has become now as an art form, although it is of course so much more than just an art in the way in our Western Eurocentric perceptions of what art is. It's so much more than art, but these are some of the curves and circles, and it's just black ink on white paper. And as I was making these curves, they would start to guide me in that year away from the line. And not only was the creative process itself helping me to learn how to create my own journey that I was on, instead of following some external rules and expectations from the teacher, the curves were helping me figure out that creative process and how to create my own pathways forward. But also, as I was creating, it was like portals would open for this voice to come through, and this voice kept coming through. And for some context, I was brought up secular. I had no religious or spiritual beliefs. The only reference point I had for hearing voices was schizophrenia and mental illness. And so I was scared. I thought I was losing my mind, and it wasn't that it was someone else's voice I was hearing, it was my own voice, but it was like the words were just coming so fast and so quickly. I had no control over it. It was stream of consciousness, and sometimes all over the place and multidimensional and hard to really even capture and write down in words what was coming through. And I thought I was losing my mind. But I continued making the curves and writing the stories and the poems and the things that were coming through. Eventually, I found myself wandering the world in India and Nepal and trekking in the Himalayas and hanging out with the monks and learning about Buddhism and Taoism and Eastern spiritualities. And that was opening my world to a whole new world. And Fritjof Capra's the Tao of Physics became my Bible. I'm looking at the relationships between science and spirituality and mysticism and quantum physics and the oneness of everything with everything, and how my art was also telling me the same things, and how spirit was also saying the same things. And it was a very fascinating time of discovery and exploration. And I eventually came to accept that this voice was not coming out of nowhere. It was coming from somewhere. This was spirit. It was spirit guidance. And it felt in particular like a spirit grandmother. She felt like a grandmother who would come to me, you know, especially in times of need when I needed guidance. And so this curve art, that I call it, was quite instrumental in guiding me during this time and opening me up to what I refer to as my nonlinear ways of knowing. And eventually, before talking about coming back to school, I'm going to share a couple of those teachings from Spirit Grandmother that came through. One of them in particular was a creation story, an origin story that she spoke through me as I was making some of the curves. And she said, "Come, child. All forms begin as a curve. You began as a curve. The Great Spirit touched to the ethers and set a wave in motion. This wave coiled and bent and arched and folded and broke symmetry again and again until a unique curvature of space and time emerged and became you. No two curves are ever exactly the same, so you became a unique curvature of space and time. Your curve is your original name, the original essence of your being, your original name, the name that Great Spirit gave you. And when you listen carefully, when the wind blows, you will hear your name called. And when the waves crash onto shore, you will hear your name called. And when you listen deep down into your soul, you will hear your name called. Lean into it. Bend into it. Follow it home. And I said, but Mother, how did I get so lost? You know, I was just feeling so lost at times in that year. And she said, you stopped listening, child. You stopped listening. You stopped hearing your original curve, the one the Great Spirit gave you, your original name. You started hearing only the name your parents gave you and the name your society gave you and the titles your educational institutions gave you. You stopped hearing the wind and the waves. You have forgotten your language. You have forgotten your original name. But remember, she said, the curve never leaves the thing it becomes. It is always with you. Even if you have forgotten how to hear it, your curve is always speaking through you. Lean into it, bend into it, follow it home. She said, patterns find themselves. That is the nature of a pattern, to come back to itself again, to find itself. Patterns find themselves. The curve never leaves the thing it becomes. Remember where you came from. Remember the language that first made you. It is the language of curvature. The language of curvature. The language of curvature is the language of the land. Remember. Remember coming back down into that original native land. There are no straight lines in nature. The language of nature is the language of curvature. Remember the language of curvature. It is the language of the land. It is the language of circularity. As Sandra Steyer says, it is the language of self in relationship. All of these nonlinear languages. This is what you're made of, she would say. And so it was through these dialogues that I began remembering my nonlinear language, and I began remembering where I even needed to go to remember to remember. I had to go to the land and the art and the creative process and spirit. And nature, art, and spirit became my teachers in that year. But then I went back to school. And that was hard. That was hard, conforming back into those boxes again. And that's when I called out to Mother, to Spirit Grandmother, and saying, why? Why do they keep making me memorize these things? Do they think memorization is the same as remembering? Why is no one asking me to remember my knowledge? Have they forgotten their own? And that's when she responded. And she said, come, child. Listen. The straight line memorizes itself. The straight line memorizes itself. The circle remembers itself. You are made in the language of curvature. You are made to remember what you are made of. And she was very particular to make sure I understood the double meaning of the word remember. The circle remembers itself. It comes back together again. It remembers, brings itself back to itself, to its wholeness. And it remembers in that it carries the knowledge, the memory of how to come back to itself. It carries the memory of how to return. It remembers and it remembers itself, and you are made with that knowledge of how to come home to yourself. No matter how many times this world has flattened you and boxed you in, I made you to know how to come back to yourself, to remember your indigenous knowledge, Sankofa. Yeah.